Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Arts Performed podcast. This episode was recorded under the former title Student Expert Podcast. Please enjoy.
Welcome to Toby's Student Expert Podcast. On this platform, Toby will engage with student experts, their field of study, passions and interests. My name is Oli I. My field of study is politics and philosophy. My expertise is the field of resistance, mysticism, and particularly stand-up comedy and psychedelic experiences.
Before interviewing Oli, I had not expected such a, what I kind of see in some ways as quite a circuitous route towards the idea of psychedelics and what they do for you. But once I arrived at the interview and started getting his ideas of his connection with psychedelics, what I hope you realise by listening to it is that it's much more than that. It's something much deeper. We go into psychedelia and consumerism, we touch on mysticism, talk a little bit about Terrence McKenna, but also his very deep influence from Bill Hicks. Please enjoy. It's an interesting combination.
Yeah, it was sort of I kind of went on a bit of a journey through my my masters, and I kind of initially started off with the ideas of stand-up comedy as a practice of resistance. So we were given quite free rein just to kind of do whatever, and they literally asked us in the first seminar, what do you think resistance means, what do you think it is, and they just asked us to kind of conceptualize it. And from a young age I'd sort of always been a fan of stand-up comedy, and then when I got into my teenage years just got really interested in Bill Hicks, and ended up pursuing that as sort of the main part of my master's thesis, was sort of all on Bill Hicks.
Okay. So what was the actual master's?
It was political thought and practices of resistance. So we were looking at resistance in quite a broad sense, looking at it in art, in religion, politics, really quite a broad spectrum.
Right. So with the stand-up comedy, how did you kind of connect those bits? Was it just an exploration?
It was kind of an exploration, but I think I did my MA part-time, so it was sort of in the first year I was getting really into stuff to do with mysticism. I was taking wild modules in mysticism, but I was always kind of coming back to Bill Hicks. I think probably Bill Hicks initially sparked my interest in psychedelics, and so I always sort of kind of came back to him. And then I was looking at stuff to do with Gnosticism, so kind of alternative, well, more original versions of the Bible, particularly with like the Garden of Eden story. And I was just in a very kind of strange way was connecting all of these different ideas, sort of to do with humans having their own divinity, kind of being these inherently spiritual beings, and that is kind of us resisting against the routine way of doing things, this kind of very human way of living life, and I think people like Bill Hicks through his comedy was really able to break down a lot of those preconceptions about how the world should be. I think he really kind of brought it to a lot of people, and so I think it's kind of like the psychedelics helped him do that quite a lot.
Because I know he was, I don't know what exactly he did, but was it a lot of LSD that he did?
he was particularly fond of mushrooms, and he talks about I mean, you mentioned Terrence McKenna to me earlier. He was really fond of Terrence McKenna, particularly with Terrence's stoned ape theory.
Stoned ape theory.
So Terrence McKenna basically, to kind of sum it up, I don't know how well I'm summing it up, but it's the idea that once we came out of the trees, started going onto the grasslands, then we would have just been eating things that we would find, and some of those things would have been magic mushrooms, which Terrence believed accelerated our evolution. And then Bill Hicks has this whole skit about him pretending to be a monkey, just like walking around, and he, steps in some cow poo and then like picks out a mushroom and then starts eating it, and then goes from that to then like going to the moon. So he was really kind of positive about psychedelics and their influence in human evolution, in thought, in kind of piercing through this veil of I think what Bill Hicks and other people kind of perceive to be something quite dark and sinister, kind of controlling everything, this capitalist mindset where everything's got a price tag on it, and it's not actually just that, it's kind of people with a lack of talent and it's all commercialised, but it's actually all this kind of quite sinister agenda to it, because people have a lot invested in keeping people under the illusion that they have to keep spending money, they have to keep living the way they do. What Bill Hicks talks about as the ride, and he has this monologue at the end of his show Revelations, where it's kind of really sort of this defining point, and it is slightly funny, but it is more kind of serious. And I think with the psychedelics, Bill was quite serious with it. Certainly when he was tripping, he would, from reports from his friends, he wouldn't kind of joke around. He would take the experience very seriously. They'd all go off to a ranch and do it, setting everything kind of carefully planned out.
I'd like to go from this idea of consumerism, Bill Hicks resisting against those conventions of consumerism, and that by taking certain hallucinogens, you could see through the perceptions of reality. What I have difficulty with is, so this idea of consumerism and resisting against consumerism and capitalism and convention with hallucinogens, or even with something like stand-up comedy. Is there not a danger that by using drugs or other things like music or other ideologies, that you could, even though you've got the right intentions, the way you consume it and the way you engage with it is as a consumer?
Of course. I mean, the psychedelic world, one could argue is kind of heavily consumerist. If you're looking at things like ayahuasca retreats, ayahuasca tourism in Peru, people spending thousands of dollars.
I heard Simon Anstall.
Yeah.
He did that.
Yeah,
so
he had quite a nice experience.
Yeah. See, I don't detract from the experience. It's particularly the way Westerners get engaged with it. It seems often to me that they're going to a different place to find themselves.
Well, I mean,
I'm not saying they can't.
No, I think particularly in the UK, what we're kind of seeing is this sort of pagan revival, because people are realising they don't necessarily have to go to Peru and spend thousands of dollars, flying there and meeting a shaman. I mean, I'm talking, from a biased perspective of someone who has never taken ayahuasca, who doesn't really ever feel like they want to, on the basis of what I've kind of been put off by with a lot of the ayahuasca tourism, how, you know, you'll go to one shaman and that shaman will badmouth another shaman. So the shamans themselves are kind of being drawn into this consumerist mindset. You know, I guess, is it necessarily the consumerist mindset, or is it the intentions of people? So, for example, you know, if you look at a place in Peru called Iquitos, where all the ayahuasca tourists get to the airport, and there's people like, as if you were sort of like, you know, in...
It's calling you into the restaurant.
Yeah, it's like if you're like a holiday rep, you know, trying to get you, come to this ayahuasca retreat, and it's kind of like, well, how do you navigate? How do you know who's going to actually offer you healing? And are these people actually there for healing, or are they there just to have the experience? And then I would say something like a polar opposite I've been looking at recently. There's one place in the whole of the UK that offers ketamine therapy for depression. Legally, yeah.
Okay.
And it's in Oxford. So if you're factoring costs, let's say if you're coming in from London, the treatments, I kind of calculated it, you're looking at around £1,000. But it's kind of like, this is the one place that's kind of been approved and is known about, and it's kind of legal. But it doesn't have all of the like song and dance of the shaman and going to the rainforest and having that experience.
So what you're saying is it's a clinical experience.
Yeah. Whereas something like that, you know, there's been a lot of studies done recently with ketamine and depression, show it's really effective. I mean, I literally stopped smoking tobacco the day after a difficult ketamine experience, because my friend was talking to me about tobacco. And I have a big belief that it does kind of reroute certain patterns in the brain and help you build new pathways so you get out of these patterns of addiction or patterns of depression where you keep telling yourself the same story over and over again. But it's kind of, that to people would probably seem, you know, like expensive. But then if you're like, well, it will cost you $1,000 to go to Peru and be a shaman, it's kind of like, well, you know, we're seeing the shaman, and the shaman knows everything, even though there's no kind of real connection to the culture or anything. And I don't want to kind of come across as being this like anti-cosmopolitan person, because I grew up in London and went to school with everyone from like every single...
Do you mind if we hold?
Yeah, sorry.
Just
sorry, we're just doing an interview here. Sorry, we thought you were at work. We're just doing a podcast recording.
Oh God, sorry.
I can bring in some ideas from the previous interview that I did. He talked about depth psychology, mystical experience, Buddhism, ideas of non-dualism.
Yeah.
With those ideas, can you say something about that?
Okay. Depth psychology I've never heard of. Mystical experience, I mean, kind of difficult to say where to start with it. What is a mystical experience? What's a religious experience? Are they one and the same thing? Has religion got anything to do with it? I mean...
So what about if we say from ideas of non-dualism? The way he explained it to me is that conventional idea of dualism is that there is a God and there are humans.
I mean, I think the majority of mystical experience mystical experiences are dualistic. I think on the pure basis of someone saying I had a mystical experience, that is a dualistic concept. I don't know, it's really a tricky one. I've never had a non-dualistic mystical experience. I've been trying to wrap my head around it for a long time, how you could have a non-dualistic experience and know that it was a non-dualistic experience. Because the moment you start to talk about it, then you're bringing in the ego, which is creating dualism. Because how could you report a non-dualistic experience?
This is kind of what we were exploring through that conversation. So he was saying about the non-dualistic experience is you're not two, but you're not one. So it's like two hands together in prayer.
Okay.
So it's kind of like our experience of society as well. The modern ideologies, individualism, consumerism, we get what we want, we take care of ourselves. But in reality, we are living in a very non-dual environment. I suppose what he was getting at in terms of the non-dualistic spirituality is that using words like mystical experience or any words at all it kind of corrupts what the truth is. Me telling you that yesterday when I was praying, for example, I had an experience and I cried. Telling you that after the fact, I might be trying to relay it as clear as possible, but you're not going to experience the same as seeing me or even interacting with me in that experience. Can you try and engage with what you feel is a mystical experience? What is mysticism?
That's a really difficult one. What is mysticism?
Yeah. I mean, approach it any way
I think it, for me, it kind of boils down to this notion of stepping out. So what the Greeks called ecstasis, which is this ecstatic experience, but it is this stepping outside of, the ordinary confines of our perceived reality. Whether that's kind of necessarily anything to do with like a higher power or not, I mean, I think...
Because he comes from a Buddhist point of view, an Eastern point of view, where their ideas of a mystical experience is letting go of attachments to identity and desires and language, and that includes ideas of something that's separate from them. So if they think of something like Buddha, they don't see it as something other than them. It's not a dualistic thing.
I mean, in that sense, I don't know how necessarily kind of separate the sort of Eastern traditions are to like the Judeo-Christian rhetoric. I mean, I don't know, whether, the idea of God being a separate thing is just there as a metaphor. There's a prayer in Judaism called the Shema, which translates as hearing. And it is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. You should, speak the name of the Lord to your children. Speak the name of the Lord when you walk along the way. Write it on the, your door. When you lie down, when you rise up." This idea of kind of constant reverence to God, a similar kind of way as like Hare Krishnas would do. I remember being on the tube in London, standing next to a Hare Krishna guy, and he's just muttering Hare Krishna under his breath, because it's this constant idea of being in contact with this higher power. I guess if you're doing that constant contact, then possibly the idea of dualism, non-dualism is a bit irrelevant, because it's not really anything other than this sort of non-dualistic experience where you are invoking God, or you're just there living and breathing it. I guess kind of dualism possibly implies that it's like you can have this experience and then you go back to your like normal life and everything. Whereas a dualistic experience, I don't know whether experience is necessarily even the right word, because if it's non-dualistic, it could just be this state of being,
Well, I suppose you're connected at that moment. So you are being. You're not connected to anything else.
I mean, the only thing that I could possibly describe as a non-dualistic experience that I have is when I'm playing music, whether it's an absolute just like, and I don't know whether it's from playing music through using psychedelics, but I feel like a vessel rather than this thing that's producing it. But it's like, so there's this intersection of the vessel and the music, which is out there and is, out there in nature.
But he said that where we use mantras, they go beyond the words that you're repeating.
I mean, I find it, from just a musician point of view, particularly if you're listening to Hindu mantras, the way that there's like certain accents at certain points. I kind of came to the conclusion once when I was listening to Chants of India by Ravi Shankar, and I was on quite a strong dose of 2CE.
2CE?
2CE, yeah, it was the first time I'd ever done it.
What's that?
It's a synthesised version of mescaline, so it's probably the closest synthesis to mescaline. And when I was listening to some of the mantras, I had a vision of my consciousness being like an orb inside a box, and it was sort of floating around, and the sort of accents on the mantras were almost like bouncing the ball away from ever touching a wall, so this orb was like constantly kept in the centre. It wasn't going over too much to one side because it was being sort of shaped around by these mantras. And I came to the conclusion that that's what it's doing to your consciousness. It's really cementing this idea that the consciousness should be in this state of flux, where you're not just kind of settling on a fixed idea of anything, because that could completely take you by surprise. And it kind of trains your consciousness to sort of be in this divine contact whilst also kind of remaining grounded. I think they're there to kind of hold the space, as much as they are symbolisms, as much as they are in reverence to certain gods, and it is about bringing certain things into your life. I think the whole practice of doing it is like a practice. It's something that you do constantly to keep your consciousness in this kind of state of flux.
That's what you felt with the 2CE.
Yeah, when I was in that experience, I really felt like that was the whole purpose.
So you think that's the kind of purpose of what we should be doing?
Possibly. I think the more kind of practical means we have for divination, the better.
Divination?
Yeah, I think kind of taking us to this point where we feel like we are in the presence of something, whether that's talking about it in a dualistic sense or a non-dualistic sense. If we are in this kind of flow of something happening.
Can you just explain though? Because I've always, when I understood divination, I always thought of divination as a tool, kind of almost fortune teller tools, or to find water, or to find riches, or to find things.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by divination? Because I've never heard it used in that context.
I think it's kind of getting us, I don't know, into that thing where those kind of otherworldly things are actually possible. Whether it is like finding water or finding something like this, it's getting into this state.
State of flux.
Yeah. Right. But actually, I don't like to say like higher state, but like I mean, like I found when I was doing things like practicing kung fu, it was like doing this divination where like things were possible
So
that weren't necessarily possible before.
So there was a similar experience in terms of...
Yeah, sort of like alchemy in a sense. It's like this sort of internal alchemy where you're bringing yourself to these levels where you're able to access certain things.
Can I pose something to you?
Once again, an unexpected journey through some interesting ideas that I'd never considered before. I certainly never expected someone with an interest in psychedelics to be talking so deeply and so kind of spiritually about psychedelics, mysticism, resistance in terms of stand-up comedy, specifically Bill Hicks. In the next episode next week, Oli and myself will be continuing this very interesting journey, so thank you very much. And to end this episode, once again, here is Oli.
Why shouldn't we trust our perceptions? Why should we seek to change our state of consciousness, or why should we be in flux?
I think it's a natural drive to want to change our consciousness.